Okay, so here we have our finished cuffs, and they're looking beautiful. And I've got them nicely shaped around the wrist, and everything's matching good. And so I'm just gonna talk to you about, we'll go ahead and work on this one. I'm gonna talk about where the button and buttonhole goes on the cuff. All right, so here's our finished cuff right here. And as you know, buttons go right on center front or center back along the front, and the buttonholes start about 1/8 of an inch over towards the raw edge from where the buttons go. But here we have a cuff, so where do we put it? There's no center front, center back. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna measure the cuff, and we're gonna find the middle of the cuff. Okay, so this cuff is 2 3/8. Well, it's about 2 1/2, but it gets, because of the curved edge, and it sometimes gets a little bit smaller after you sew it and turn it. So I'd say it's just under 2 1/2, just a little bit less than 2 1/2. So what I'm going to do is we need the buttonhole here, and the button will go on this side. But what I like to do is to put my buttonhole in first, measure it, and figure out where it goes, and then open up the buttonhole and then close it, and then put my button exactly where it needs to go, just in case my buttonhole might have moved a little bit. So what I'm going to do first is, let me grab a few pins here, and I've got a marker. So I'm going to go to the middle of my button, middle of my cuff. So if this is 2 3/8, then that would be 1 3/16. So I'm just going to put that right there. So there's 1 3/16. And so that is the middle of my cuff right here. Okay, then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my buttons, and I've got these beautiful blue buttons here, and they are 7/16 big. So the pattern calls for 3/8, so you can get 3/8. This is 1/16 bigger than that. A 1/2 inch button would work too, but they're a little on the big side, so I like to do either 3/8 or this 7/16. So that's my button. So what you do is you take the size of your button, and you go the diameter of your button back from the raw edge. So if I go back 7/16, I'm just going to mark that from this point here. Okay, and so 7/16, there's 2, 4, 6, 7. So there is 7/16 right there. Okay, so that's where my button should go. All right? Okay, if that's where my button should go, then that means my buttonhole needs to back up 1/8 of an inch, so that if it's 1/8 of an inch longer, then there's room for the button to sit, which means my button will sit kind of in the middle of the end of that buttonhole. So you take your diameter of the button, and that's where your button sits, and then you take minus 1/8 back towards the edge, and that's where your buttonhole starts. So my buttonhole starts right here. So let me take that out. So that's where my buttonhole goes. And then I need to go the length of the buttonhole back into the garment. So what you do is you take your diameter plus the thickness of the button. Okay, so if I look at this button, and when I measure the thickness of that button, it measures about, well, it's a little less than 1/8. It's a little more than a 16th, but a 16th and a half, forget it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 1/8, and that'll give me just a tiny bit more room. So now I'm going to go make the length of my buttonhole 7/16. Okay, so there's 7/16 plus 1/8. That's great. I know this is going to drive people crazy, but that's 9/16. So that's how big my buttonhole needs to be. Okay, so I've got it marked where it goes, and it'll go back into the cuff. But before I do that, I'm always going to do a trial buttonhole. And I'm going to do one up on my scrap fabric, and I'm going to do it the size that I had planned. and then I'm going to cut it open, and I'm going to put it over the button, make sure everything fits, make sure the buttonhole's working good on the machine, and get everything ready to go. So that's the first thing I'm going to do, is just a trial buttonhole.